One night recently, I had a double feature of two things I don't normally get to experience. The first one was that I attended a film premiere by a YouTuber, and the second is that I was so annoyed by what then transpired that I walked out of the Q&A. I removed myself from the Discord for that creator, and while I'm sure I'll continue to watch new creations, I'm just not the same from when I first walked in that door. Through all of this, I learned a lot more about the subject he was covering, but I also learned a little bit more about myself. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It, a podcast about technology, history, and getting myself out of debt. Thanks to Jeff Atwood and the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. No mystery or build-up. The YouTube creator was Kevin McKay, also known as Bobby Broccoli, on YouTube. He also has a channel on the Nebula service, which will come up later. But he's been creating documentaries about science and often about scientific fraud or controversies within science for a good number of years now. He has an excellent speaking voice. He has a wonderful way of stringing together words so you stay connected to find out where he's going and where he ends up. When it works well, it's fantastic. His works ballooned into documentaries over the past few years, getting millions of views, covering scientific subjects like faked human cloning, non-discovered elements, the budgetary and science reasons behind super colliders, and even my favorite kind of documentary, a deep dive into the technology and business of Nortel. He makes documentaries that I really want to watch, and which I recommend to others. Deep dives into personalities and business can be done very poorly, but he has never fallen into that trap. So when he announced that he was going to show a new documentary at a local movie theater to me, I couldn't resist. He was coming in from Canada and having a premiere. Of course I would go. And with a lot of effort, I made it through rush hour traffic, and I attended. Now, this was at the Angelica Theater in New York City, and when I went in, they had already seated people, and some clearly kind organizers asked me if I was there for the Bobby Broccoli show, and then gave me a ticket and a program and told me to go to the Yellow Theater. Fair enough. Down the stairs I went, into the Yellow Theater, and I sat down for the documentary. It's called 17 Pages, and it covers a controversy involving a paper that was submitted to a scientific journal where 17 pages of notes were later classified by a whistleblower as not just incompetence, but possibly fraud, intentional fraud, and the 10-year battle that was waged after that, long after the scientific stakes had been settled, but instead focusing on how scientific fraud was going to be reported, litigated, and decided on. For that reason, it's an incredibly important case. In the same way that there are car crashes, but a specific car crash may involve individuals that change the course of history afterwards, this combination court, legislative, and governmental case resulted in a lot of lives being held back in many different ways, but also decisions and, one would hope, improvement. And initially, recognizing the style, I was happy to see this film. But then some doubts creeped in for me. His speaking style was a little flat, and when he would portray different people in different ways, they would use drawings, renderings of those people. and depending on which side they were, they would sometimes be rendered with an almost evil countenance, literally eyes aflame, a caricature of a person drawn out. I also found it not up to the standards of his usual cutting through all of the complication to give us the direct story. It was, instead, a flatly read, overcomplicated, hard to follow combination of science, litigation, and names that I was just absolutely falling back on, like I was taking a class and I had missed an important reading. Again, I had been through a dozen of his long-form documentary sets on YouTube, sometimes listening to episodes a few times over months, just enjoying the cadence, and so little of it was here. But years of film festivals have given me a training in being able to get to the end of a sequential film that has a beginning, a middle, and a finale. So when the clear last parts of the film began to show, I was fine. I did find it weird that a person who had been discussed and given drawings throughout the film suddenly appeared on camera, fully lit and professionally recorded, but I chalked that up to an odd editing choice. And when the film finished and we were sitting there with the credits, it was assumed that the filmmaker would come out. There was a pause, really a set of complications as people sat down in front, prepared for a Q&A, and to my surprise, a good number of people started coming into the theater from elsewhere and sat down in our theater. Not just a few people, a few dozen people. I thought it was family members, but it was way too many people for anything like that. And the host asked a question that changed for me definitively the tenor of the evening. They said, "Was anything missing for you?" Well, naturally, we didn't know what to say to that. And then it was revealed. There wasn't one documentary. There were two. There were two full-length documentaries written from two different points of view. Literally the same story, retold through what apparently was supposed to be two different perspectives. Was the person who had written the paper telling the truth, or was the whistleblower telling the truth? In other words, we'd literally seen half the movie. And the movie was 4 hours long. We had only seen 2 hours of it. I went through a panoply of emotions at that point. First of all, I like to see films. I don't like to see half of them. I can tolerate a 4-hour movie. I've sat through some films that are truly some of the most annoying aspects of 1.5 hours of content jam-packed into 3 hours. I've been there. But this wasn't that. At this point, we found out about another conceit. Everybody who used the Nebula streaming service, which had funded this documentary, had their user accounts assigned to one of the two films, and then you would be shown that random film as the first one, then shown a short film mentioning how perspective is important, and then explaining that there was a second part. I'm sure that they started to discuss the details of filmmaking, of process, about how they went about this. But I couldn't tell you what they asked, because I left. And on the drive home, I swapped between thinking I was overreacting and then getting angrier. I think I was angry on a number of levels. First of all, my time had been sort of wasted. I had made this huge effort to come down to see half the film. As it stands, I'd actually really wasted my time, because I had to go on the Nebula service and then watch both parts. It turns out, actually, that they rendered the part I saw wrong. It had pieces of both films in it. They had actually made a mistake when they were rendering this version. So, if you're keeping track, I spent 4 hours watching a 2-part film presenting the same information from 2 different perspectives, and I watched a 2-hour preamble in which I saw one of the perspectives, poorly edited, and feeling like it wasn't put together with the same care and approach of the actual production quality 2 parts. Again, in film festivals, I have seen rough cuts. I have seen films with missing pieces and then later seen the completed project. I usually don't do that within the same 24 hours. But here we were. I have watched 6 hours of a 4-hour documentary that should have been a 2-hour documentary. Actually, it could have been an hour and a half. An hour and a half cut really beautifully tight, capturing everything that was discussed in great detail and with the traditional, well-explained documentation and graphing that I know this filmmaker is capable of, followed by me adoring it and being happy that I came down. This was a lot to process, because while the story itself is actually not as fascinating as it was made out to be, I also realized a few things about myself. I love documentaries. I spent years making documentaries, planning documentaries, spending time with the research, and doing my best to tell the story in a way that audiences that I am aiming for appreciate them. Even if they don't particularly care about the subject matter, I've tried to give people hooks, visually or spoken, so folks can at least watch it to some extent and derive value and entertainment from it. I've been here. I'm not passive. I've seen documentaries that blow me away. Documentaries I've hated until literally the last act, when they put everything together and you suddenly realize what was being attempted, and you're just swept away by the power of what this narrative did to you. I've also had many films I've watched where I wait for the shoe to drop to understand why we have to empathize with this subject, and it never, ever comes. I've been through it all. But what angered me here was the conceit. The conceit of the film was that there were not just 2 sides to the discussion, but that these 2 sides were so all-encompassing in their reversal of belief of each other that they could not be presented in the same linear narrative, in the same editing, without question mark, without something happening. I can't even imagine what that bad thing is. I felt like here was somebody who up to this point was a scientist first and a filmmaker second, and for that reason his science was amazing, and his ability to break down to the core aspects of the scientific discussion, well, it could often be breathtaking. We could see truly complicated ideas being laid out so that I felt smart watching them. He had different portrayed graphs that he would move throughout the narrative, so you could always track down where you were. If you were shown a periodic table or shown a bunch of elements, he could explain where the discoveries came leading up to the element that had been fraudulently discovered. The fact that he was able to do this came from the science first and then discovering this other technique. But watching this experience and taking these hours out of my life to give him every chance to portray to me what he was going for, that Kevin McKay, Bobby Broccoli, misunderstands a basic tenet of documentary film. Documentary film is not presented to show one truth. It is not necessarily designed to only give you a list of unquestionable facts and then reach an inevitable conclusion and then run the credits. Sometimes we don't know what actually happened. We often don't. Person A says this, person B says this. You surround them with evidence and knowledge gleaned from them or from people who know them or knew them if they're gone, and then you trust the audience. That's how documentaries work. That's how many documentaries work. If that's not what you're doing, you are doing a very long video essay. And I have further thoughts on this, but I'll put them in part 2. This is Jason Scott Talks His Way Out of It. Thanks to James Bekoyanu, Ernie Hershey, Michael Rubin, David Fisher, Dilip Reddy, Sean Kelly, Trixie the Cat, Joey Mink, Martin, Sembiance, Benjamin Guts, and Anonymous, along with the hundreds of other supporters on Patreon and elsewhere who have been supporting me and helping me get out of debt. To be continued.